What I've been talking about up to this point in time is history and the legacy of history. And obviously, that legacy matters, but there are big differences now compared to the past. Salmon are gone, and people are less lethal. And so that creates an auspicious point in time and leads me to the next main topic, which is the potential that still exists for grizzly bears to live in places where they don't live. And the basic point that there is still lots of potential suitable habitat for grizzly bears beyond the Great Divide. So just to review again what that potential looks like, the result of a lot of work on the part of many researchers. What you see in light green here again is a synopsis of what all that research has shown in terms of the location of potential suitable habitat for grizzly bears, much of it encompassed by what I'm calling the grizzly bear promised land. So more concretely though, what would grizzly bears eat there? Which is an essential facet of that potential. So yes, salmon are gone, but there's still lots of food for grizzly bears to eat. Looking again at distribution of berries, the darker the green, the greater the potential abundance and diversity of berry-producing shrubs. So in the north, huckleberries and serviceberry, predictably a mainstay of the diet as we go further south, picking up increasing amounts of chokecherry and buffalo berry. In the south as well, picking up a fair amount of whitebark pine that still survives. And of course, whitebark pine, the source of fat-rich seeds that are especially important to female grizzly bears. And then there's also army cutworm moths, something I haven't said much about. So each one of these dusky green blobs that just showed up encompasses a site where grizzly bears are known to consume army cutworm moths in the northern continental divide, also in the greater Yellowstone. Moths are consumed almost entirely by grizzly bears in alpine talus on sites where the moths aggregate. After migrating from the Great Plains, most of the consumption of moths occurs between mid-July and mid-September. Now it's an open question though as to whether there are any aggregations of moths in central Idaho. Probably the best prospect is in the Bitterroot Mountains, but that is yet to be determined. We can go beyond just general propositions about what grizzly bears are likely to eat based on the foods that are present to some modeling such as that done by Mark Boyce and John Waller, where they've looked more specifically at where productive habitat will be located during different seasons of the year. They focused on the Selway-Bitterroot Recovery Area, so a somewhat bounded analysis. Nonetheless, their results here are shown for spring, summer, fall. The darker the purple shading to red, the greater the concentration of productive habitat during the particular season. You can see, not surprisingly, that productive habitat is concentrated at lowest elevations during spring, but then that productivity migrates further up in elevation to the tops of the ridges and to the upslopes by fall. Now, correspondingly, we could expect that there's the greatest potential for conflicts between people and grizzly bears during spring, when bears are at the lowest elevations, concentrated near where people are concentrated as well, but with the notable proviso that there's likely to be a fair number of conflicts in the fall centered on encounters with big game hunters. And there have been other researchers that have gone beyond just simply modeling the distribution of productive habitat and tried to predict the number of bears that could be supported either in places without grizzly bears altogether or that are patently under-occupied by grizzlies. For example, Garth Moat. He estimated the potential for existing recovery areas, so bounded to these recovery area boundaries. He came up with a potential of 64 for the Selkirk Recovery Area, 130 for the Cabinet Yaak, closer to 450 for the Selway-Bitterroot, which was close, or at least in the same ballpark, as what Mark Boyce and John Waller came up with for that same area, roughly 320. Troy and I also estimated potential carrying capacity, if you will, for various recovery areas, but not restricting ourselves to the recovery area boundaries. So we came up with between 80 and 123 for the Cabinet Yaak, but notably for central Idaho, we estimated that when considering the totality of the potential, perhaps as many as 620 grizzly bears could live there. You put that all together, and excluding the NCDE, west of the Great Divide, we could probably have near 800 to 900 additional grizzlies, which is a non-trivial number. It's been long recognized that there is substantial potential for grizzly bears in central Idaho, codified in the designation of a recovery area there back in the mid-1970s. And importantly, it was the only recovery area designated in the absence of any documented grizzly bear residency. So yes, the potential is obvious. And as a natural consequence of having recognized this potential, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service moved ahead somewhat aggressively with a plan for reintroducing grizzly bears to central Idaho. Manifest in the publication of a document in 2000 laying out the specifics of their plan. Some key elements: grizzly bears were to be reintroduced as part of an experimental non-essential population, which functionally meant that the bears that were dropped into this ecosystem would get essentially no protections, other than the obvious in terms of preventing people from poaching them. Correspondingly, there were supposed to be no restrictions on resource extraction activities, such as logging, grazing, mining, even industrial recreation. It was to entail dropping 25 grizzly bears into the ecosystem over a 5-year period. All of this under auspices of a citizen management committee that was, as it turned out, stacked to disproportionately represent resource extraction industries. So I would argue not a very auspicious set of elements, not a very auspicious recipe for having a successful reintroduction or the establishment of a burgeoning population. As it turns out, that recovery plan or that restoration plan didn't go anywhere, thanks to the convergence of national and state political forces. The plan was published at about the same time that G.W. Bush was elected. We also had Dirk Kempthorne, governor of Idaho, a state dominated by Republicans, and emblematic of the attitudes of Republicans at both the national and state level was this quote from Governor Kempthorne: "I do not want to see an antisocial flesh-eating animal brought into Idaho." Although I think that could apply to a lot of people. But for good or for bad, this reintroduction plan sank under the Scylla and Charybdis of national and regional political forces and hasn't gone anywhere. Now, aside from any other aspect of the plan, which, as I observed earlier, I wouldn't consider it to have been very auspicious, we also have some data by which to judge whether just simply the reintroduction plan itself would have worked, just in terms of the number of bears that were being planned over this 5-year period. And we actually have some data we can look at that might be germane, and it pertains to the program instituted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to augment the imperiled grizzly bear population occupying the Cabinet Mountains, just immediately adjacent to the northeast from central Idaho. To sustain this population, the Fish and Wildlife Service has been dropping a number of bears into this portion of the Cabinet Yaak ecosystem. 19 bears over a 17-year period, so near as many bears as would have been planned for central Idaho over a longer period of time. Of these 19 bears, only 2 were known to have successfully reproduced, which represents a not very auspicious 15% success rate. Now, applying these results to what was planned for central Idaho, again realizing that what was observed in the Cabinet Mountains is not necessarily extrapolable without condition to central Idaho. Nonetheless, assuming that 25 grizzly bears were to be helicoptered in, essentially, likely we would have only gotten 2 that would have reproduced. More importantly, we had this reintroduction plan coupled with an overarching recovery plan for all grizzly bears in the northern Rockies that would have left our grizzlies isolated in 5 different populations, each comprised of no more than a couple hundred grizzlies. Roughly 800 in the northern continental divide, 700 in greater Yellowstone, 400 or so in central Idaho, 60 perhaps in the Selway, 100 perhaps in the Cabinet Yaak, all left surrounded by a veritable sea of alligators. But more importantly, I would argue that robust restoration is in fact possible. And not only robust restoration, but restoration that is likely to come about naturally by virtue of the efforts of grizzly bears on their own. So here's what we potentially could have. Everything in dark green, what I would consider to be potential core habitat, light green, peripheral habitat, where we could conceivably have low densities of resident grizzly bears. And the grizzly bears themselves are showing us, as I just said, that they can indeed live in this interstitia. Each one of these lavender dots represents a documented instance of a dispersing or colonizing grizzly bears. So they are getting to central Idaho with their own feet, including a bear that showed up more than 10 years ago in Kelly Creek, and an additional one that just showed up this year in the same general area. But also including a bear that showed up last year near Stevensville on the golf course. A young bear dispersing from the northern continental divide. Unfortunately, it was deemed to have poor etiquette because it was digging divots in the golf course, and because of that unceremoniously trapped and transported back north to the northern continental divide ecosystem, despite the fact that it was on the doorstep of the Selway-Bitterroot ecosystem. Now, interestingly enough, this young male bear was digging earthworms in the golf course. Now, this is noteworthy, at least to me, because I did not know of bears consuming earthworms anywhere else in North America other than in Yellowstone. It was definitely attention-getting to read that this bear was digging earthworms. And I guess the point of that is that grizzly bears will probably be showing us that there's a lot more foods than we might think for them to eat. So all of this having been said, having recognized that there's ample potential, what's the imperative to realize that potential? Which gets to the question of how many bears are enough. And we can answer that question in several different ways. One, by just simply looking at history and looking what we've achieved in context of what we've lost. So, emblematic of the relevant trend, here what you see in an XY diagram form is the approximate trajectory of grizzly bear populations in the contiguous U.S. going back to 1800, when we probably had close to 59,000 grizzlies. And then this period between 1850 and 1950, when we lost most of the bears that we once had, roughly 98% of the total. So what have been our gains since then? We probably were at a nadir of around 1,100 in the mid-1970s. Since then, we've come back up to perhaps 1,700, which amounts to recouping about 1% of the totality of what we lost between 1800 and 1950. So in this context, representing only a trivial gain, I think that could hardly be considered recovery. Perhaps more useful, we can look at what scientists have deemed necessary to ensure the long-term viability of grizzly bear populations. So what would be a minimum viable population, a population of bears contiguous with each other, demographically connected? And the consensus seems to be somewhere around 9,000 bears. That's in contrast then to the approximate 1,700 bears we have now in the contiguous U.S., divided amongst 4 different populations that are not demographically connected. So just in terms of sheer numbers, only at roughly 20% of probably what we need. Now, when I throw out a number like 9,000, a lot of people roll their eyes and would claim that there's no conceivable way that we could have this many bears in the contiguous U.S. Well, they're probably right. We could have perhaps as many as 3,000, but to get to 9,000, we need to step back and take the broad view. So here, looking at the Canada-United States border, the totality of grizzly bear distribution in the Rocky Mountains spanning that border, everything in dark green is core grizzly bear distribution, everything light green, peripheral grizzly bear distribution. Here's our recovery areas. And here's what we could have if all of the potential suitable habitat in the contiguous United States were realized, if we had grizzly bears in all of these areas. And I've highlighted in a different shade of green 2 potentially key areas. An extant population occupying the northern continental divide and adjacent Canada that I'm calling Heart of the Grizzly Bear Nation. And I'm calling it the Heart because this is going to be the source likely of most bears that would disperse to and ultimately colonize central Idaho, in a key fulcrum kind of position relative to the totality of what we could have. And then, of course, the grizzly bear promised land. When we put that all together, we could easily have in excess of 9,000 grizzly bears as part of a single grizzly bear population, demographically connected, ranging all the way from the Yellowstone ecosystem north through central Idaho, on through southeastern British Columbia, central Alberta, up into the Yukon.